average, right, that gap is closed. And I think one of the interesting things we know too is that if we go back, say, to the late 1960s, most women, even college-educated women, did not expect to be working at age 35. So when they were in college getting a degree, they were thinking, well, I'll get my degree and I'll get out, and maybe I'll work for a bit and then I'll have kids, but I won't be working at age 35. So they didn't make choices in college that would prepare them for the labor market later on. The majority of those women actually at age 35 found themselves working, okay? But they were underprepared for the world of work because their expectations were, as you say, were not there. If you ask women, young women today, like my college students, they know they're going to be working at 35, most of them. So they're making different choices. And that's why when we break this data down across ages, the gap among men and women in their 20s is much narrower, even in the aggregate, than the gap between men and women in their 50s or 60s or older. So we're seeing that gap narrow over time. If I had to make a prediction, if we had this conversation in 10 years, I'm willing to bet that 75 number is much closer to 80, right?
But, there's a view that there's a marginalization of men in many societies, and because you have that marginalization of men, particularly in the economic sphere, men are being surpassed by women.
Well, and I think one of the things that we've seen happen is the structural changes in Western economies that we've seen that have moved more towards service jobs and more towards information jobs have, in relative terms, rewarded women who often have comparative advantages at that kind of work. And the traditional, in quotes, work that men did that was more physical kinds of manufacturing labor simply isn't there anymore. Right, and so what we've seen is a shift in the last, however, a couple of decades or whatever, towards jobs that are more, that play to women's advantages more than men. It's another reason why, again, that even in the aggregate, that number has shrunk. And we see much higher labor force participation rates among especially women with young children than we saw, say, 30 years ago. So there's more women who have the college degrees, who can earn the wages and can afford to pay for daycare and so on, who are in the market now.
So sooner or later, your myth is not going to be a myth.
That's right. That's sooner. I'm hoping
your myth is disappearing.
That's okay. If
it is a myth.
If we get to a world where men and women, where that 75 number becomes a 90 or 95, that would be great.
Isn't it moving in that direction now?
It is. It is, and it is because, right, what we're seeing happen is that men and women are looking more alike in terms of their labor market characteristics. Women have caught up and in fact surpassed men in terms of college degrees. More women are entering fields that do pay better. What we really haven't, and the interesting part though, is we haven't seen the shift sort of the other way, right? Because one of the issues here is that women are still the primary caregivers at home. And to the extent that remains the case, that makes it harder for women to match the earning power of men in markets, even if they have the same background and training. And so one of the things certainly a lot of feminists argue is that men need to step up more at home. If we think equalizing that gap is a desirable goal, one way is if men take more responsibility at home, it frees women to earn more. I think the interesting question there, though, is for many women, it may be just that they prefer having that flexibility. They want to be the primary caregiver, so they want jobs in which they have flexible hours or maybe can reduce to part-time certain times and all that kind of, but with that flexibility tends to come, all other things equal, lower wages. And so how men and women and families negotiate these things, I think, is very complex and very specific to particular relationships and marriages and households. And so if we try to pass laws that say, well, we have to equalize these wages across the board, we're going to disrupt those delicate processes that take place between husbands and wives and kids trying to figure out how to make this work.
You've written a couple of books. What is micro foundations?
Micro foundations refers to the fact that when we talk about the macro economy, when we talk about inflation and unemployment and these sorts of big picture things, we have to remember that ultimately the reason why those things matter and what brings them about are the small individual choices that people make every day. So it's not as if we say the savings rate causes a change in income. We have to understand that through the way in which individuals and households make choices about savings and other kinds of things. So the micro foundations idea is that even the things that economists refer to as macroeconomics, those big picture kinds of things, have to work and do work through the individual choices that people and households make.
From the context of developing countries or third world countries, or however you want to call it, how do you see some of these concepts like the micro foundation?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think one of the things, certainly the gender pay issue and gender issues are absolutely crucial issues in developing countries. There we often see women have borne the brunt of the household work and which is much more difficult work when you don't have the technology, and we often don't count that kind of work as part of the contribution women make to the economy. So I think those things are important there too. These questions of inequality and standard of living and so on that we think about in the West also become crucial there too. How do we generate the kind of growth and technological progress that can bring prices down, bring wages up, and really allow markets to provide for the average and for the poor in those parts of the world, just as they have in the West.
The world is entering a new economic order, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly globalization and the relative increase in service and information jobs, and the speed at which we're all talking to each other. It's a different game than it was decades ago.
And because of this different game, it is a more complex world.
It is a more complex world, indeed, and that's why there's a great, wonderful book titled Simple Rules for a Complex World by a guy named Richard Epstein, and that's why I think the more complex the world gets, the less we know about it, right? And the more our sort of arrogance about how we think we can move people around like pieces on a chessboard can get in the way of having really good, simple rules that allow people to organize themselves.
In 30 seconds, tell me, how are we going to get out of this rut, this deep recession that we're in? You are a professor of economics at St. Lawrence University. You are supposed to know the answer.
If I knew the answer, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be out selling my consulting services and making lots of money. I think the real answer
that is what they're paying you for, to be a professor in this big university.
I think it's not that big. I think that one of the things we have to do is we have to get out of the way of ordinary people and try to keep the cost of creating new businesses, try to allow people to engage their entrepreneurial spirit and begin to bring jobs back. We don't need a master plan to get out of this recovery. We need to let individuals and households, we need to free them, and the political sector needs to stop experimenting and tinkering and changing their minds every 30 seconds and say, nope, we're done, this is it, you guys start moving again, get this thing going.
Professor Steve Horwitz, thank you very much
My
for being
pleasure.
here.
My
Appreciate
pleasure.
it.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you, Godfrey Eneas.
Thank you.
We're going to have you back. We're gonna
Tell-
have you.
Tell my host, bring me back.
We'll have you back. we like you. We'll bring you back. Thank you for watching and listening to our program today, and we thank the Nassau Institute for arranging these wonderful guests that they have coming to us from time to time.
Because they bring a very different perspective.
Yes, and quite educative, as you would say. Thank you very much for watching and listening. Good evening, everyone.